Ms. Bavia was a mentally competent, young woman who suffered cerebral palsy and degenerative arthritis, leaving her completely bedridden and dependent on others to perform all her activities of daily living. Despite having a college degree, she was financially unable to support herself, did not have a stable living condition and relied on public assistance for all aspect of her care. Even before her illness became so debilitating, she apparently had not had an easy life. She had neglectful parents, failed marriage to an ex-convict and had suffered miscarriage. In 1983, at age 26, she expressed a desire to end her life. Ms. Bavia then attempted to accomplish this by self-starvation in a California public hospital. She refused nutrition and hydration until hospital policy overruled her wishes and required the insertion of nasogastric feeding tube since she was not terminally ill. It was at this time that Ms. Bavia took her case to the legal system in the state of California in the case Elizabeth Bavia v. Riverside Hospital. The court ruled in favor of the hospital, citing that while she had the right to determine her life, society did not have the obligation to assist her in committing suicide. In addition, the court cited the need to preserve life, support of current legal precedent, protection of the obligations and interest of the hospital, as well as protection for similarly disabled individuals as reasons for ruling against Ms. Bavia. The California Appellate Court heard her case in 1986 in Bavia v. Superior Court. The appellate court ruled in Ms. Bavia's favor, overturning the prior ruling based on the premise that a mentally competent adult has the right, in the exercise of control over his or her own body, to determine whether and to what extent to submit to medical treatment. The appellate court reversed the trial court's determination and held that Ms. Bavia had the right to have the nasogastric tube removed because she had a fundamental right to refuse medical treatment. The right to superseded the state's interest, the quality of life was a valid and essential consideration, and lastly, fulfilling the patient's desire to refuse treatment was not equivalent to assisting patient in committing suicide. After the appellate court's ruling, the feeding tube was removed and Ms. Bavia was eventually discharged from the facility. In the months that followed, Ms. Bavia continued to lose weight and suffer increasing discomfort from arthritis and other ailments. She then entered a private convalescent hospital, agreeing not to attempt starvation. Despite winning her case in 1986, Ms. Bavia later explained in an interview with Los Angeles Times that by the time the Superior Court ruled in her favor, she had begun a morphine regimen whose side effects made the process of starvation unbearable. In her interview with the reporter, she expressed continued contempt of her own existence.
So now we will be talking about the different perspectives on suicide. But before that, we have to define what suicide is. It is the intentional termination of one's own life, whether by omitting something, such as the life supports which keep the patient alive, or by doing something. So here are some thoughts to ponder. Is suicide ethical or unethical, and when is it considered ethical or unethical? So basically, there are 4 arguments or perspectives regarding suicide which will be discussed in the next slides. So for the first argument, it is the religious and theological views on suicide. In this case, suicide is considered unethical because our lives belong to God and are merely loaned to us, so we have no right to dispose of our own lives even though we have the right to use them within limits. As such, we have also no right to take the life of another. But there are limits to this argument, as the religious sectors allow some form of passive suicides in cases such as the need for extraordinary means to continue existence, a person who lays down a life for a friend, or an individual who suffers martyrdom for the sake of religious faith. The Japanese Buddhists also considers suicide as ethical as long as the individual was in a state of selfless equanimity. This is in connection to their strong belief in afterlife and death. So the second argument or perspective states that human life is so precious and is the basis for all other goods, such that suicide is considered unethical because it is to act against the greatest of all human goods, or at least against the good on which all other human goods depend. This only holds true as long as the specific condition of life is not stated. This view or this argument allows the ethical passive suicide in cases such as permanent vegetative state in which the individual is barely recognizable as human, and when life is painful and crushing that it renders all other goods impossible. Thus, life in this situation or condition is no longer the substratum for all other good things.
For the third argument, or perspective on suicide, it condemns suicide because it harms the community. It is unethical, as most individuals are valuable to society, and society has a legitimate interest in preserving most of its citizens, and suicide can easily turn to homicide. On the other hand, suicide may be ethical, as the individual is the intrinsic good and not the community. The individual must consider the impact of his or her actions to the society, but the effects on society are not the decisive factor. And if it leads to financial savings. Example is, if a person who is 70 years old committed suicide at the first sign of serious illness, there would be tremendous savings in the Medicare and Social Security costs, pointing that suicide is not simply harmful to the community. Next, fourth argument or perspective on suicide. It proposes that suicide is wrong as it has substantial consequences to other individuals. In this argument, suicide is unethical because according to the empirical form of the wedge principle, exceptions will lead to the dramatic spread of the suicide. In the logical form of the wedge principle, it argues the need for consistency to prevent any form of exceptions regarding suicide. And suicide affects the rights of others, such as spouses and children in particular have important legal and moral claims on would-be suicide. For example, if a child's claims to such things as food and shelter are not met because of a suicide, society will be burdened with the child's support. On the other hand, it may be ethical as the value of the human person is not solely or even primarily dependent on her or his utility for others, either singly or in group. Some important points. All major theories appear to allow room for exceptions. Certainly, some cases, the person can quite reasonably decide that, all things considered, continued existence is more evil than the termination of existence. When already dying and life is consumed by pain, the value of biological existence may, in the view of some patients, evaporate into nonsense and becomes a serious moral question for loved ones. Active suicide, although generally an evil, is not universally evil. It can be ethical for the patient, granted proportionality of all things considered. However, to commit suicide in certain circumstances is not to say that patients have a right to do so. The ethical correctness of active suicide does not necessarily imply a right not to be interfered with, let alone a right to have others help them. It is clear that the refusal of treatment, even considered as passive suicide, is ethical given a proportionate reason, all things considered. The arguments on suicide reveals a common thread that the life of the individual is an element of larger picture that morally limits the individual's actions. This establishes the tension between the individual's autonomy and the moral limits on the exercise of that autonomy.
Christianity and voluntary death. Advocates of euthanasia within the Christian tradition have been few in number. A major reason for this phenomenon is the widespread conviction that euthanasia is prohibited by the Sixth Commandment and thus not an option that a Christian may seriously consider. In short, mercy killing is murder, and murder is not a moral option. Undergirding the authority of the Sixth Commandment is a theological conviction that only God has the right to give and take life, the act of mercy killing being viewed as an illicit exercise of what is solely a divine prerogative. However, one advocate of euthanasia, the clergyman Leslie Weatherhead, has met this condition with a provocative counter. Death, we told, should be left to God. We do not leave birth to God. We space births. We prevent births. We arrange births. Man should learn to become the Lord of death as well as the master of birth. For centuries, physicians have adhered to the sentiment as described by the Hippocratic Oath. One of the clauses included in the historic commitment is this: I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody who asks for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. Those who subscribe to the oath promise to refrain from participating in two actions now known as euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Euthanasia is the intentional act of taking a human life for the purpose of relieving pain and suffering. This can occur actively or passively. Active euthanasia involves an intentional act on the part of the physician toward a patient that causes death. Passive euthanasia involves withholding treatment with the intent to cause death. Physician-assisted suicide, or PAS, is a type of voluntary euthanasia in which a doctor either intentionally provides information to a patient about how to commit suicide or prescribe the means that allow the patient to commit suicide. There are three primary arguments in favor of euthanasia and PAS: autonomy, minimizing pain and suffering, and the idea that there is no morally relevant difference between taking steps to hasten death and allowing the dying process to occur. Even though a physician intentionally ending the life of a patient was considered unthinkable for centuries, Western sentiment seems to be changing. In fact, both euthanasia and PAS are sometimes referred to as death with dignity. But the Bible teaches that euthanasia and PAS are actually enemies of dignity. Let's consider what the Bible might have to say about these arguments. Mercy killing. Those who advocate euthanasia and PAS do so for largely understandable reasons. They wish to take away the suffering of terminally ill individuals, and they may even claim that there is a moral obligation to do so. In fact, in Canada, if a physician refuses to participate in euthanasia or PAS, he is legally required to refer patients to a physician who will. But the Bible teaches that suffering is not necessarily something that should be avoided at all costs. Romans teaches us to rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Similarly, James teaches this: count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The Roman Catholic Church does not accept that human beings have the right to die. Human beings are free agents, but their freedom does not extend to the ending of their own lives. Euthanasia and suicide are both a rejection of God's absolute sovereignty over life and death. The Church believes that each human life is a manifestation of God in the world, a sign of His presence, a trace of His glory. The life which God offers to man is a gift by which God shares something of Himself with His creature. A human being who insists that they have the right to die is denying the truth of their fundamental relationship with God. For most people, including Christians, rejoicing in our sufferings is not easy. A dying person screaming in pain or weeping in loneliness in a hospital bed does not want to be told to be joyful in his suffering. And indeed, he generally shouldn't be. But Christian ethicist Gilbert Melendez said, we should maximize care rather than minimizing suffering, which might include eliminating the sufferer. Likewise, the authors of Always to Care, Never to Kill in the journal First Things concluded, although it may sometimes appear to be an act of compassion, killing is never a means of caring. Inspired by Melendez and the authors of Always to Care, Never to Kill, Stephen Phillips, an Indiana professor and physician, once thoughtfully suggested that sometimes True care is holding someone's hand and suffering right alongside with him. It is not taking his life or suggesting that he take his own. Freedom of choice. Others in favor of euthanasia and PES cite personal autonomy and freedom of choice. Everyone, they argue, has a right to die when and how they choose. And in fact, human dignity includes this. But consider the words of Job. A person's days are determined. You have decreed the number of his months and have set limits he cannot exceed. Euthanasia and PES assert a desire to be infinite and reject a dependence on God, the author of life and controller of death. Withholding treatment, a morally relevant distinction. Advocates would insist that there is no relevant difference between euthanasia or PES and withholding life-saving treatment from a dying individual. They claim that since withholding medical treatment can be permissible, euthanasia or PES must also be permissible, because the end result, the death of a person, is the same in either situation. Therefore, there must be no difference between any of these actions. This, however, is simply not the case. Allowing to die involves withholding treatment without an intent to cause death. This is a form of beneficence, or preventing harm to a person. Examples might include removing a ventilator from a grandmother with no hope of recovery, or choosing to refrain from potentially fruitless chemotherapy. The authors of Always to Care, Never to Kill explain it like this. It is permitted to refuse or withhold medical treatment in accepting death, while we continue to care for the dying. It is never permitted to take any action that is aimed to the death of ourselves or others. God commands, you must not murder. Jesus also commands us, love your neighbor as yourself. Allowing someone to die by withholding the treatment may combine these two sentiments, because the intention is to care for a person in the best way possible, rather than to cause death. The morally relevant distinction between euthanasia or PES and allowing someone to die involves intention and benevolent care. Enemies of dignity. So God created human beings in His own image. The image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. Genesis chapter 1 verse 27. Human beings are created in the imago Dei, the image of God. This alone gives us inherent dignity and a value to our lives. At some point, determining that our lives are not worth living fundamentally rejects this dignity. Euthanasia has been legal in Belgium since 2002. Thousands of individuals in this country alone are euthanized each year. Countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and others are perfect examples of how opening the door to voluntary euthanasia leads directly to the practice of non-voluntary euthanasia, which is the killing of the sick individuals who are incapable of consent, and even involuntary euthanasia, which is the killing of sick individuals against their will. These practices, although abhorrent, become normalized when a society deems certain lives not worth living. Euthanasia and PES reject the inherent dignity that God has given human beings. Participants seek to eliminate suffering, but they instead eliminate the objective value of life. Although the Bible does not speak to either euthanasia or PES directly, Christian thought demands a critical and biblically based approach to the subject. The value of human life in all its forms and at all stages is the central theme of the gospel, for it is the very purpose of Christ's birth, death, and resurrection. To fail to respect human life at any point mocks the very essence of Christ's mission to humanity.
The concept of assisted death. What is assisted death or assisted suicide? It is a general term for helping a patient to terminate their life. Majority of assisted suicide requests are from severely or terminally ill patients. One question raised by the case of Elizabeth Bovia is what to call the intended action: suicide, rational suicide, assisted suicide, euthanasia, voluntary death, and self-deliverance. To help sort out this semantic welter, 2 points can be made. First point, euthanasia. It is a killing of one person by another or others for allegedly merciful reasons. The case presented cannot be said to involve euthanasia since the death was initiated by the person herself. Second point, it is inaccurate to say that a terminally ill patient who forgoes medical treatment thereby commits suicide. Suicide, it is a case where a competent adult without a terminal illness causes her own death. It is important to maintain distinction between foregoing treatment in terminal illness and committing suicide, because if a death is classified as a suicide, many life insurance companies refuse to pay benefits and it is illegal to assist in a suicide. The issue in the Bovia case is best described as assisted suicide because she had no terminal disease but she could not easily kill herself and so needed help from others, particularly the medical staff members, hence the term assisted suicide.
Ethical issues for and against assisted suicide. There are three strongest traditional moral arguments against suicide. Number 1, it shows disrespect for human life. Number 2, it violates one's duties to contribute to society. And number 3, it wrongs one's friends and family by hurting them emotionally and by depriving them of support and companionship. However, there are counter-arguments. It is arguable that one need not to respect life itself, but rather the qualities of a particular life that make it worth living. If, as a result of illness or other misfortune, a person's subjective enjoyment of her life is so diminished that life is a burden to her, she may end it without showing disrespect for her own humanity. Number 2, if suicide is wrong because it deprives society of an individual's contributions, it is a relatively minor wrong. It is implausible to suppose that everyone is so essential to society that anyone's refusal to contribute further constitutes a grave public harm. Moreover, the devotion of modern democratic society to the protection of individual liberty would oppose the creation of a social duty to live. Number 3, the argument that a suicide wrongs her family and friends is refuted by arguments resembling those used to refute the state interest in protecting innocent third parties. The obligation not to hurt friends and family is contingent on there being people who will be hurt, and so cannot entail that suicide is wrong in itself. Some suicidal people may have no dependent or close friends. Indeed, it is the elderly and the isolated who are most likely to commit suicide. These counter-arguments, of course, do not prove that suicide is right in all circumstances, nor do they decisively refute the position that suicide is always wrong. They do, however, challenge the categorical moral condemnation of suicide and suggest that courts should not rely on moral disapproval as an unquestioned foundation for the state interest in preventing suicide. Rationality and competence autonomy. So what is rationality? It is the habit of acting by reason, which means in accordance with the facts of reality. The physician has the social commitment to sustain life and relieve suffering. Where the performance of one duty conflicts with the other, the preferences of the patient should prevail. Looking back to the case of Elizabeth, upon hospitalization, she subsequently disclosed her intent to stop eating and thereby die by starvation. She requested that the hospital staff provide her with pain medication and hygienic care until she died. She stated that she no longer wished to live because of her disability, and that because of her disability she was physically unable to commit suicide. Her physical disability included diagnosis of quadriplegia and cerebral palsy. As a result, she was bedridden and dependent on others for support in daily living activities. Ms. Bovia, a mentally competent adult, refused nutrition and hydration until hospital policy overrode her wishes and required the insertion of a nasogastric feeding tube since she was not terminally ill. It was at this time in 1983 that Ms. Bovia took her case to the legal system in the state of California. So she had a case against Riverside Hospital. The court ruled in favor of the hospital, citing that, while she had the right to determine her life, society did not have the obligation to assist her in committing suicide, since Ms. Bovia's motive for refusing treatment was to die, and the court issued an order allowing the hospital to commence force-feeding her by inserting a nasogastric tube. This was the rational decision by the court. To continue, she had several unsuccessful attempts to find a publicly funded apartment with visiting nurses to provide care. Miss Bovia once again became a patient in a public hospital, and in 1986, she was eventually transferred to High Desert Hospital, another public facility. When Miss Bovia could no longer be spoon-fed without nausea and vomiting, HDH inserted a nasogastric tube against her will to avert potential starvation. Miss Bovia sued the hospital and its staff. The hospital staff argued that the interests of the state should prevail over the rights of the patient to refuse treatment. Traditionally, viable state interests include number 1, preserving life, number 2, preventing suicide, number 3, protecting innocent third parties, and number 4, maintaining the ethical standards of the medical profession, including supporting the right of physicians to effectively render necessary and appropriate medical services. The trial court denied Miss Bovia's request, stating that her prognosis, which indicated she could survive an additional 15 to 20 years with adequate nutrition, justified the state's interest in preserving her life. So she has lost again. However, she did not stop there, but she had an appeal this time. Competence autonomy sets in. The appellate court acknowledged that a competent adult has the right in the exercise of control over his or her own body to determine whether and to what extent to submit to medical treatment, has a basic fundamental right to refuse any medical treatment even if it may save or prolong his or her life. The competent patient is entitled to make the ultimate decision about what care will be rendered, with the patient's interests and desires are the key ingredients of the decision-making process. So what is the criteria for competence? The standard criteria for competence assess 4 main features of the decision-making process. Number 1, the patient's understanding of the relevant medical facts. Number 2, their appreciation of the information's personal relevance for them. Number 3, their ability to reason in certain basic ways. And number 4, the ability to express their decision. From the beginning, she understood everything that is happening to her, so these are the facts. So the principle of respect for autonomy directs that the patient's wishes should be honored, including those regarding the nature and extent of his or her health care. As long as the patient's wishes are reasonably established, courts usually follow the principle of autonomy when conflicts occur. As seen here, the appeals court upheld Miss Bovia's right to make her own medical decisions by requiring the hospital and staff to respect her desire to refuse nutritional treatment while continuing the pain control to which she had consented. Through a series of legal movements, the California Appellate Court heard her case in 1986 in Bovia versus Superior Court, wherein the Superior Court ruled in Miss Bovia's favor, overturning the prior ruling based on the premise that mentally competent patients have the right to refuse treatment and that the state's interest in preserving life does not outweigh this right. So she won this battle against the Superior Court.